Hey there folks, the #1 White Stripes fan from the Infinite Jukebox, here with another entry in my Rock Hall Reviews series for 2025, and possibly my last for this year, but we'll get to that at the end of the video. First things first, what is the Rock Hall Review series, you may be asking? It's a yearly series that I do on this channel where I talk about each of the current year's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominees, give one album by each of them, a review, and then talk about if I think they should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and if I think they will get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Two questions that more frequently than you would ever expect or want have very, very different answers. And today, I'm talking about none other than garage rock revivalist legends, the White Stripes, and their magnum opus from 2003, Elephant. Now, this is probably going to sound strange, considering Seven Nation Army is one of those songs that everybody hears 1 million more times in their lifetime than they would ever really care to actually listen to it on their own, but I do kind of think the White Stripes have sort of been underappreciated in recent years, and I think I know why. A lot of the early 2000s garage rock revival scene that kept mainstream rock music raw and alive both critically and commercially saw the birth of bands that went on to do major things or otherwise be totally forgotten. I mean, the Arctic Monkeys are now one of the most successful touring rock bands on the planet and have eclipsed really almost all of their peers from the UK revivalist side of things. Since then, I mean, really, they're just one of the most popular bands on the planet and have been for well over a decade now. The Strokes made an absolutely stunning comeback with the new Abnormal, and since then have pretty much been on top of the world, and a lot of the other bands from that era, like, say, the Libertines or even the Walkmen, have kind of been a little bit forgotten since then, and that's a shame because they don't really deserve to be forgotten. And the White Stripes, despite being massively commercially successful and culturally impactful, are kind of in this weird gray area. They broke up before they really got the chance to continue honing in on that commercial success and legacy, yet at the same time they have some of the most iconic rock songs of the 2000s as a decade. So where does that leave them with this record Elephant in terms of quality? Is it an album that deserves to be continued to be loved, or is it a record that, you know, kind of has aged a bit poorly? And if you can't tell by the fact that I'm kind of defending the White Stripes right now and talking about how people should talk about them more despite them already being very popular, I really love this album a lot. The album kicks off with Seven Nation Army, a song that hurts my heart deeply as a bassist because everyone thinks it's a bass line. It's not. It's a guitar riff, and for that alone, I'm going to have to give this record 0 stars out of 5. With that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching the Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next. No, all jokes aside, I really do love Seven Nation Army as a song. No amount of times that I hear it at a sporting event could ever change my passion and adoration for that track. Between the cryptic lyricism, the great bridge and progression throughout the entire song, it's really astounding. And then from that moment on, we get into some of the most raw yet polished moments of the White Stripes' career, leading to a record that's kind of difficult to totally depict. It's an album that feels controlled in terms of its chaos, but at the time never feels like an overly polished effort that tries to be a little too ambitious for its own good, like some of the White Stripes albums after this would unfortunately kind of feel like at times. I mean, you have tracks that are nothing short of almost garage punk, like Black Math, for example, but then at the same time, you have some pretty tightened up, tight, generally speaking, musically, songs with The Hardest Button to Button, or the very mysterious Meg White vocally led In the Cold Cold Night, a horribly underrated track, in my opinion. I just think, generally speaking, this album manages to kind of be the bridge between two eras of the White Stripes' career that were somewhat flawed in two different ways, and really manages to perfect both sides of them. It's not as raw and totally unfiltered and at times lo-fi as some of their earlier works, nor is it as overly polished and sometimes directionlessly ambitious as some of their later efforts. It's kind of that perfect medium, and it leads me to feeling like this record is almost the White Stripes at their best, really, at their peak. I'm not saying this is my favorite album. It's tied for White Blood Cells as far as my favorite White Stripes record goes, but I would say it's arguably their most artistically successful in terms of execution, between some of the more piano ballady kind of moments like I Want to Be the Boy to Warm Your Mother's Heart, some of the heavier moments like the bluesy, almost metal adjacent at times Ball and Biscuit. It just all feels like it really comes together here in a way that perfects each corner of the White Stripes' varying degrees of influences perfectly. And obviously, a lot of that has to do with Jack White. I don't think I really really need to wax poetic about why he's considered one of the last true great guitarists. And while I do disagree with the sentiment that he's the last guitar god or anything like that, because that's just kind of bullshit made up by people that don't listen to new music beyond anything that charts on the Billboard charts, I do also kind of understand the sentiment that some people hold where he's one of the last true legends, chronologically speaking, with a lot of guitarists since then not really having been around long enough to really have the kind of catalog that White has at this point. And I would argue that Elephant is him really at his peak in a lot of ways, as a guitarist with some amazing licks and solos found throughout this record, as a songwriter, some really brilliant songwriting throughout, as well as his continuous embrace of a lot of his 60s songwriting influences that you get on a number of tracks here that I think is honestly kind of nice to hear in tracks like There's No Home For You here, for example, where he kind of goes into this sort of almost semi-saccharine storytelling kind of direction where it, gets him to be very personal and sort of ditches intentionally a lot of the very over-the-top but vague songwriting styles that you got from a lot of other major rock bands of the early 2000s. Take a look at like Nickelback or Creed, for example. And I do think that Jack White's vocals are honestly some of my favorites of this particular era of rock music. I know that might be a bit of a polarizing statement, since not necessarily everybody loves Jack White's vocal style. I know it sounds like nails on a chalkboard to some, and maybe it's just because it reminds me of Jeffrey Lee Pierce from the Gun Club, one of my favorite punk frontmen of all time, and one of my favorite bands of all time. But Jack White has always been a standout, charismatic presence behind the mic for me. But Jack White's not the only member of the White Stripes. In fact, there's two members of the White Stripes. Ooh. That other member being, of course, drummer Meg White, and I'm really glad to see her get some retrospective appreciation within the last few years, because there was way too long of a time where people were just absolutely shitting on her. And now, whether that was for her simplistic drum style, or if that was because she had a simplistic drum style and also had the audacity to be a woman, it depends on, which hater you ask. But in my opinion, Meg White, while not one of the all-time greats or anything in terms of technicality, because obviously, I do think that the intentionally simplistic and childlike drumming that goes on throughout not only this record, but most of the White Stripes' discography is integral to their sound. It provides that raw rhythm section that Jack White is able to work over absolutely perfectly. He's able to expand upon these ideas, and Meg White lays the solid groundwork for them with this very simplistic and just meat and potatoes kind of drumming style. I'm sure that she could have added extra fills and embellishments if she really wanted to, if she felt like it, but I don't think that was necessary. In fact, I almost think that her trying to be just as self-indulgent as Jack White admittedly is at times, musically speaking, would have been a major mistake, and maybe would have made this record feel a lot more muddy and less authentic than it ultimately does with the way that she presents herself and her style here. And ultimately, I think that she's just as, if not in some ways more important than Jack White in terms of creating the recipe for the White Stripes' sound here. There are definitely some moments here that the White Stripes' general fan base kind of sees as lesser, at least in my experience. Like, yeah, Little Acorns isn't the best song in the world, but I still think it's pretty great overall, and the fact that I would consider it probably the worst song here is just testament to how amazing a lot of this record is, especially at its peaks. Again, talking like tracks like Ball and Biscuit, The Hardest Button to Button, There's No Home For You Here, I Just Don't Know What to Do With Myself, etc. And I know a lot of people really dislike the way that this album closes out with the track, Well, It's True That We Love One Another, and I get it. I understand why people don't like it. It's a very strange way to end this very energetic, raw, garagey album by having this kind of country stomp-along kind of tune that feels even more folksy than something like Hotel Yorba, which is saying a lot. So I can see why somebody wouldn't like that way of ending off the record. But personally, I think it's great. I think it's an excellent come-down from all of the energy that precedes it, and I think it's a fun little tune that's just enjoyable in general, and I like the way that it gets both of the Whites involved here. And as a whole, I think it's a really solid way to be, sort of a final chapter for a record that honestly would have been difficult to end in my eyes. An album that's never truly punk, never truly heavy enough to be considered like hard rock or anything like that, but at the same time is never really soft enough to naturally transition into something like that at the end of the record. So really just tacking on that track at the very end, I think was actually a good idea. It feels like a fun, jovial, kind of joyous way of ending off a record that was already very fun, just in a different way sonically prior to that song. So yeah, Elephant, not only a brilliant record and both members of the White Stripes at their peaks in terms of performance, but also just maybe my favorite White Stripes record from a creative standpoint and from an ambition standpoint as well. Truly the last time that the White Stripes felt like a totally perfected band. I mean, I like Get Behind Me Satan and Icky Thump and think that some of their best tracks come from those albums, no question, but as the White Stripes became more ambitious, they had just as many misses as they did hits from track to track. Elephant feels like them condensed at their absolute best, and yeah, I love this album overall, which is why I'm going to give this record 4.5 stars out of 5. Now, do I think that the White Stripes deserve to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Yes, absolutely. I feel like no matter what standards you really use, they deserve it. If you want to look at pure influence, while they never ended up lasting as long as some of the other garage rock revival bands that came out of the early to mid-2000s, they certainly were the most important in terms of having mainstream presence overall. Some of the biggest hits of that particular era came from the White Stripes, and in a sense, I wouldn't say they single-handedly kept popular rock music alive, but they certainly carried a lot of that weight, especially when a number of bands that came from that scene, era, movement, whatever you want to consider it, kind of ended up vanishing by the end of the decade, unfortunately. If you want to look at iconic status, then yeah, absolutely, everybody knows the White Stripes. When you see the colors red and white next to each other, and someone says this is music related, you know it's the White Stripes. Jack White is one of the most beloved guitarists of all time at this point, and one of the most influential voices in the music industry as far as musicians go, between his work within the realm of physical music, within, you know, the realm of production, within the realm of music venues. The guy has his hands in a little bit of everything in the music industry, and he's a beloved figure, which kind of makes me shocked that he hasn't been inducted already. And Meg White, like I said, has been getting a lot of retrospective appreciation. Some people intentionally and properly rewriting history so that she gets the credit that she's always been due. And from the perspective of commercial success, sure, they were probably eventually outdone by like the Arctic Monkeys in the 2010s, and maybe even the Strokes by now, but I don't necessarily think that album sales really matter that much when everybody knows at least a couple of White Stripes songs. Everybody and their great-great-grandmother who, you know, was a nurse in World War II knows Seven Nation Army, for better or for worse. Whether you love that song like me or you hate that song like a lot of people surely do. Everybody knows it. And beyond that, a lot of people already know the music video for The Hardest Button to Button, or the initial riff to Fell in Love with a Girl, and the Lego animated music video. There's so many things related to the White Stripes, both musically and visually, that are so successful, so iconic, so memorable, so ingrained in popular culture at this point, that even if they do kind of begin to fade away from some people's minds, as a lot of bands from this era, or at least a couple, managed to continue in a way that the White Stripes never did, I don't think they can ever truly be forgotten. Maybe less appreciated, but never forgotten. And in that sense, yes, they absolutely do deserve it. They should have gotten in first ballot, in my opinion. Now, do I think the White Stripes will be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame this year? You know, I would love to say yes. I really would. And I think it'll happen soon, because there's no way that they can just keep waiting on the White Stripes to be inducted. But at the same time, I don't know. This year, I don't see it happening. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is just too stuck in its ways for its own good. And it says a lot that I genuinely think artists like Joe Cocker and Chubby Checker are more likely than one of the most influential rock bands of this century. But nonetheless, I do genuinely think that. And the White Stripes could definitely get in this year. Again, they have a lot of industry connections. They're critical darlings through and through. And they have had a lot of commercial success. Don't let that fact be undermined either. But also, I don't know, it just doesn't really seem like they're that much of a priority for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Not in terms of them not wanting to induct the White Stripes, I'm sure they do, but just in terms of the fact that, I don't know, Bad Company, Joe Cocker, Cyndi Lauper, Billy Idol, all of these older acts from the 70s, 80s, even 60s in some of these cases, are nominated this year instead, I don't know, they just seem more likely. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame loves older music no matter what, and if that means that you're inducting a, D-plus act from 1969 through 1974 over an A-plus or S-tier act from 2000, then, that's what the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is gonna do. And I do think that the White Stripes, if they don't get in this year, will probably get in within the next couple, for sure. I have no doubt about that. But, at the same time, yeah, maybe they'll get in. And when they do eventually get in, inevitably, I'm sure it'll open the doors for other 2000s rock bands becoming eligible within the next couple of years. The Strokes, the White Stripes, Linkin Park are already eligible. Not that they're a garage rock band, but still, 2000s rock band, just to kind of solidify my point. I'm sure they'll open the doors for those artists, but until then, I think the White Stripes have somewhat of an uphill battle. But as a whole, however, I think they have a shot this year. Not a great shot, but a shot. But if you had to, make me bet on it, then I would probably say no. With that being said, that is the end of my Rock Hall review series for 2025. I started this series in 2022, proceeded to not do anything with it for the next couple of years, and now it's back. And as long as I'm continuing to do this channel, I hope to continue to do the Rock Hall review series as well, now that I'm kind of back in the swing of it and everything. This is probably the last entry, maybe. I'm not sure yet. I'm currently deciding if I want to continue this when the inductees actually get announced, because the thing is, for those who aren't aware, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, when they announce the inductees based off the list of nominees, also induct a bunch of people in side categories. And while I'm not gonna, do any reviews on people like songwriters who aren't really musicians who get inducted, or industry people who aren't musicians who haven't made albums, because, why would I? What do I really have to say about that when I'm a music review channel? The musical excellence categories and the early influence categories and whatnot, I do genuinely think, depending on, who gets inducted, maybe I'll do videos on them. I mean, the New York Dolls seem pretty likely at this point. Roberta Flack seems pretty likely at this point. And boy, oh boy, if I was doing this series last year, would I have had a lot to say about Jimmy Buffett, because I despise that man's music. So overall, I might continue this when that time comes. I'll probably make a community post about it when I do decide, because I'm not going to be able to decide until I see who those inductees are, because I'm sorry, but if it's nothing but Jimmy Buffett types, just god-awful, unremarkable, yacht rocky suburban singer-songwriters, then I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to torture myself. I'd rather just cover new music at that point. But if it's artists that I like and have some degree of passion about, then I'll probably do it. Like I said, I'll make a community post, but for the time being, assume that this is the final entry in the Rock Hall review series for 2025. So with that being said, that is the end of this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.